At 64 years old, Wesley Snipes can look back on a life that once seemed almost impossible to derail. There was a time when his face was everywhere. His name carried enormous weight in Hollywood, and his presence on screen could turn an ordinary action movie into an event. He was fast, charismatic, disciplined, dangerous, and effortlessly cool. To millions of fans, Wesley Snipes did not simply play heroes. He looked like a man who could actually become one. But careers in Hollywood can change with terrifying speed. For Wesley Snipes, the journey from international stardom to legal trouble, imprisonment, and years outside the center of the industry became one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune experienced by a major action star of his generation. Yet to understand why that fall was so painful, we first have to understand just how high he had climbed. Wesley Trent Snipes was born on July 31, 1962, in Orlando, Florida. Much of his childhood, however, was connected to New York City, where he grew up in the Bronx. Long before Hollywood knew his name, Snipes was already developing the combination of skills that would later make him unusual among leading men. He was not simply interested in acting. He was deeply interested in martial arts. That distinction would eventually become crucial. Snipes began training at a young age, developing a level of physical discipline that was far beyond what audiences normally expected from an actor. Over the years, he studied several martial arts systems, and that background later gave his fight scenes a sense of speed and authenticity that helped separate him from performers who depended almost entirely on stunt doubles. But martial arts were only one side of his ambition. Snipes also wanted to become a serious actor. He studied performing arts and eventually attended the State University of New York at Purchase, an institution known for rigorous artistic training. At the time, there was no guarantee that this path would lead anywhere. Hollywood was highly competitive, opportunities for black leading men were limited, and action films were dominated by a relatively small group of established stars. Snipes had to find his own opening. One of his early breakthroughs came through an unexpected cultural moment. In 1987, he appeared in Michael Jackson's music video for Bad, directed by Martin Scorsese. Snipes played a tough street character confronting Jackson's character, and although it was a relatively small role compared with what would come later, his intensity was immediately noticeable. There was something magnetic about him. He did not disappear into the background. Hollywood noticed. Soon, stronger film opportunities began arriving. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Snipes steadily built a reputation as an actor capable of moving between drama, comedy, crime thrillers, and action. But one performance changed the perception of what he could do. In 1991, he appeared in New Jack City as Nino Brown. The role was explosive. Nino Brown was charismatic, ruthless, frightening, and unforgettable. Snipes gave the character a kind of dangerous charm that made audiences unable to look away. It was the sort of performance that could have trapped an actor inside one particular image. Instead, Snipes did something smarter. He kept changing. He appeared opposite Woody Harrelson in White Men Can't Jump, proving that he could handle comedy with the same confidence he brought to violent drama. Their chemistry became one of the defining elements of the film, and Snipes demonstrated that his appeal extended far beyond the traditional action audience. Then came films such as Passenger 57, Demolition Man, and U.S. Marshals. By the middle of the 1990s, Wesley Snipes was no longer simply an emerging actor. He was a star. And then Hollywood gave him the role that would permanently change his legacy. Blade. Released in 1998, Blade introduced audiences to a vampire hunter who was unlike almost anything appearing in mainstream superhero cinema at the time. Snipes brought martial arts precision, dry humor, physical intensity, and an almost supernatural sense of confidence to the character. The black coat. The sunglasses. The sword. The silence before violence. It all became iconic. Years before superhero movies dominated global box offices, Wesley Snipes helped demonstrate that a comic book character could carry a stylish, violent, large-scale Hollywood franchise. For a moment, he seemed untouchable. Blade became successful enough to produce sequels, and Snipes became inseparable from the character. To many fans, there was no difference between Wesley Snipes and Blade. He had created something that felt permanent. But the cruel irony of Wesley Snipes' story is that his greatest success arrived not long before some of the most difficult years of his life. Behind the image of the unstoppable action star, tensions were growing. Professional relationships would become complicated. Reports about difficulties surrounding later productions would follow him. Financial and legal problems would eventually become impossible to ignore. And the man who seemed capable of surviving anything on screen was about to discover that real life offered no stunt double, no rewritten ending, and no guarantee of a second take. At the height of his fame, Wesley Snipes had everything Hollywood appeared to promise. Money, recognition, power, a franchise of his own. But within only a few years, that world would begin to collapse around him. And what happened next would change Wesley Snipes forever. By the time Blade became a success, Wesley Snipes had achieved something few actors ever managed to accomplish. He had built a character that felt completely his own. Blade was not simply another role on his resume. The character became an extension of Snipes' physical ability, screen presence, and personal style. Every movement looked deliberate. Every fight sequence carried the confidence of a performer who understood martial arts rather than merely imitating them. Even Blade's silences became part of the appeal. And audiences responded. The first Blade film helped establish Snipes as one of Hollywood's most recognizable action stars at the end of the 1990s. The sequel, Blade 2, released in 2002 and directed by Guillermo del Toro, pushed the franchise even further into a darker and more visually ambitious world. For Snipes, it seemed like proof that his career had entered a new level. He was not only starring in films, he was leading a franchise. That distinction mattered enormously. At a time when superhero cinema had not yet become the dominant force it would later be, Snipes was already carrying a comic book property on his shoulders. The success of Blade placed him in a rare position. He could combine action, martial arts, horror, and superhero mythology while still maintaining the cool, controlled image audiences had come to expect from him. But success often changes the atmosphere around a star. The greater the power, the greater the expectations. The more money involved, the less forgiving a production can become. And somewhere between the triumph of the first two Blade films and the making of Blade, Trinity, the mythology surrounding Wesley Snipes began to change. The third film, released in 2004, was supposed to continue the momentum of the franchise. Instead, it became associated with stories of tension behind the scenes. Over the years, people involved with the production have described a difficult atmosphere on set. Director David S. Goyer and actor Patton Oswalt publicly discussed conflicts involving Snipes, although Snipes later pushed back against some of those accounts and disputed parts of the popular version of events. That distinction is important. Hollywood stories have a way of growing with repetition. One person remembers a confrontation. Another remembers something differently. A dramatic anecdote gets repeated in interviews, then transformed into a legend, and eventually audiences begin treating the most entertaining version as unquestioned fact. What appears clear is that Blade, Trinity did not represent the smooth continuation of Snipes' franchise that many expected. Instead, the film became a turning point. Snipes was reportedly unhappy with aspects of the production and creative direction. His relationship with Goyer was widely described as strained. At the same time, new characters played by Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel were introduced, leading some observers to believe the studio was attempting to expand the franchise beyond Blade himself. For an actor who had spent years defining the character, that shift could hardly have felt insignificant. Imagine helping build a franchise from the ground up. Imagine becoming synonymous with its central character. Then imagine watching the creative structure around that character begin to change. Whether every dramatic story from the set is accurate or not, the larger reality was impossible to miss. the Third Blade film did not strengthen Wesley Snipes' position in Hollywood. It complicated it. And that complication arrived at a dangerous moment. Because outside the movie set, another problem was developing. One that could not be solved through negotiation, editing, or another box office success. Taxes. For years, questions surrounding Snipes' federal tax filings had been building. Eventually, federal prosecutors brought a case against him, transforming what might once have seemed like a private financial issue into a public legal crisis. Suddenly, headlines about Wesley Snipes were no longer focused primarily on his movies. They were focused on courtrooms, documents, money, and possible prison time. For a celebrity, this kind of transition can be devastating. Hollywood depends heavily on image. A star is not only an actor. A star is also a commercial investment. Studios think about schedules, insurance, publicity, reliability, and whether audiences will associate a performer with excitement or controversy. The more serious Snipes' legal situation became, the more difficult it was for his career to remain untouched by it. But even before the eventual conviction, the damage to momentum was already beginning. The man who had once moved effortlessly from major studio project to major studio project was now facing a very different future. And the irony was painful. On screen, Blade fought vampires and supernatural enemies with almost absolute control. In real life, Wesley Snipes was entering a battle where physical strength meant nothing. Martial arts could not help him. Movie star charisma could not erase legal documents. And being famous did not make the consequences disappear. The case would eventually become far more serious than many fans initially understood. In 2008, Snipes was convicted on 3 misdemeanor counts of willfully failing to file federal income tax returns. Importantly, he was acquitted of more serious felony charges, including conspiracy and fraud-related allegations. But the convictions were still enough to change his life. The court sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison. For a man who had spent years portraying characters who could escape almost any danger, the reality could not have been more different. There would be no dramatic final fight. No helicopter waiting outside. No last-minute rescue. The prison sentence was real. And when Wesley Snipes eventually entered federal custody, the distance between the Hollywood superstar he had once been and the man he had become was almost impossible to ignore. The fall had begun. But prison would not be the end of Wesley Snipes' story. In some ways, it would mark the beginning of an even harder battle, finding out whether Hollywood would still want him when he came back. For Wesley Snipes, the legal battle over taxes did more than interrupt a successful career. It changed the way the public saw him. Until then, most audiences knew Snipes as the disciplined action star who seemed completely in control. He was the man from Blade, the confident presence from New Jack City, the athlete-like performer who could dominate a fight scene without appearing to break a sweat. But inside a courtroom, none of that mattered. The federal tax case surrounding Snipes became one of the most serious challenges of his life, and its consequences would follow him for years. Prosecutors accused Snipes of failing to file federal income tax returns for several years. The case also included more serious allegations, including claims connected to conspiracy and fraudulent tax refund efforts. Snipes denied wrongdoing on the major charges and defended himself in court. The trial became a spectacle. This was not an unknown businessman fighting with the Internal Revenue Service. This was Wesley Snipes, a major Hollywood actor, a man whose films had earned hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide. Every development attracted attention, and every headline made the distance between his glamorous screen image and his legal reality feel even wider. In February 2008, the verdict arrived. Snipes was acquitted of the most serious felony charges against him, including conspiracy and fraud-related counts. But he was convicted on 3 misdemeanor counts of willfully failing to file federal income tax returns. For many fans, the word misdemeanor may have sounded less serious. The punishment proved otherwise. In April 2008, a federal judge sentenced Wesley Snipes to 3 years in prison. The news shocked much of Hollywood. 3 years. For an actor at his level, 3 years was not simply a loss of freedom. It threatened to destroy the rhythm of his entire career. Hollywood moves quickly. A few months away can change which actors are considered bankable. A few years can erase momentum completely. New stars arrive. Franchises move forward. Studios change executives. Audiences develop new favorites. Snipes faced the possibility of returning to an industry that had moved on without him. His attorneys continued fighting. Appeals followed, and Snipes remained free for a period while the legal process continued. But eventually, the options narrowed. The sentence stood. In December 2010, Wesley Snipes reported to a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania to begin serving his sentence. There was something surreal about the moment. For years, Snipes had lived inside a world of movie premieres, private transportation, luxury hotels, film sets, interviews, and carefully constructed celebrity. Now he was entering federal prison. The transformation was brutal in its simplicity. Inside prison, fame could not restore his freedom. There were schedules, rules, restricted movement, limited privacy, and long stretches of time away from the career and lifestyle that had defined him. The psychological contrast must have been enormous. One day, the world remembers you as Blade. The next, your daily existence is determined by prison regulations. Snipes later spoke about the experience in a way that suggested he tried to approach it with discipline. His background in martial arts and performance had already taught him the importance of mental control, patience, and adaptation. But discipline does not erase loss. While he was incarcerated, Hollywood continued without him. The superhero genre exploded. Marvel's cinematic universe grew into a global phenomenon. Actors who once might have competed for the same action roles became franchise stars. And perhaps most painfully, Blade itself remained trapped in uncertainty. The character Snipes had helped transform into a cinematic icon was no longer under his control. That may have been one of the most difficult parts of his downfall. Because Wesley Snipes had not merely starred in successful films. He had helped create an identity. To millions of viewers, Blade belonged to him. Yet by the time Snipes was serving his sentence, the entertainment industry was entering an era in which superhero properties were becoming more valuable than ever before. And he was watching that revolution from the outside. In April 2013, Snipes was released from federal prison and transferred to home confinement before completing his sentence later that year. He was finally free. But freedom created another question. What exactly was he returning to? The Hollywood he had left behind was different. The action star landscape had changed. His reputation had been damaged. Years of his prime career had disappeared. And there were no guarantees that a studio would trust him with another major franchise. This is where the tragedy of Wesley Snipes becomes more complicated. It would be easy to describe his story as a simple rise and fall. But that would ignore what came next. Because Snipes did not disappear. He began rebuilding. Slowly. Quietly. Without the same level of power he once had. His first major post-prison return came through The Expendables 3 in 2014, where he joined an ensemble of veteran action stars including Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jason Statham, and others. There was even a knowing joke in the movie about his character being imprisoned for tax evasion. For some audiences, it was funny. For others, it was uncomfortable. Because behind the joke was a real story. A real conviction. A real prison sentence. And years that Wesley Snipes could never get back. Still, he was working again. That alone mattered. The man Hollywood had once watched fall was stepping back in front of the camera. But rebuilding a career after prison is not the same as returning to where you left it. Wesley Snipes was about to discover that the hardest part of his journey might not have been losing everything. It might be trying to convince the world that he still belonged. When Wesley Snipes walked out of federal custody in 2013, he had regained his freedom. But he had not regained his old life. That difference mattered. Before prison, Snipes had been a genuine Hollywood leading man, someone who could carry action movies, headline major productions, and command attention simply by appearing on screen. After prison, the situation was different. He was older. The industry had changed. New stars had emerged. Superhero movies had become the most valuable genre in Hollywood, but the franchise that had once made him iconic was no longer his to control. He was free, but he was returning to unfamiliar territory. His appearance in The Expendables 3 in 2014 was therefore more than just another acting job. It was a test. The film surrounded Snipes with a collection of veteran action stars, including Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jason Statham, Dolph Lundgren, and others. In a strange way, the project gave Snipes a bridge back into the industry. He did not have to carry the entire movie. He could reintroduce himself to audiences as part of an ensemble. And the movie did not ignore his past. One joke referenced tax evasion, directly echoing the real-life case that had sent him to prison. It was the kind of moment Hollywood often uses to transform personal scandal into entertainment. For Snipes, however, the joke carried more weight. His incarceration was not fictional. The lost years were not fictional. The interruption to his career was not fictional. But instead of running from the subject, Snipes appeared willing to let the industry acknowledge it. That may have been an important first step. He was no longer pretending nothing had happened. He was moving forward with the history attached to him. The problem was that moving forward did not mean returning immediately to the top. Throughout the years that followed, Snipes continued acting, but many of the projects were smaller than the films that had once defined his career. Some were action movies aimed at audiences who still remembered his 1990s dominance. Others offered supporting roles rather than the commanding lead performances that had once been normal for him. For an actor who had experienced the highest levels of celebrity, that shift could have been humiliating. Hollywood has a brutal hierarchy. Yesterday's superstar can become tomorrow's supporting player. A face once placed in the center of movie posters can suddenly appear lower in the credits. Yet Snipes kept working. That persistence is one of the most revealing parts of his story. He could have disappeared. He could have spent the rest of his life complaining about the industry, blaming studios, blaming the legal system, or living entirely off the mythology of his earlier success. Instead, he continued searching for roles. And eventually, something began to change. In 2019, Snipes appeared in Dolomite Is My Name, the acclaimed comedy drama starring Eddie Murphy. The movie told the story of Rudy Ray Moore, an entertainer who refused to let rejection stop him from creating his own success. For Snipes, the project carried an almost accidental symbolism. He played Derville Martin, an actor and director recruited to participate in Moore's wildly unconventional film. The performance gave Snipes something audiences had not seen enough of during his action-heavy years. Comedy, timing, eccentricity, vulnerability. He was funny in a way that surprised people who remembered him primarily as the deadly serious Blade. And suddenly, critics were talking about Wesley Snipes as an actor again, not simply as a celebrity associated with a tax case. That distinction was important. For years, the story surrounding him had been dominated by downfall. Now the conversation was slowly shifting back toward talent. He followed that appearance with Coming to America in 2021, once again working alongside Eddie Murphy. Snipes played General Izzy, an exaggerated, theatrical military leader whose energy was completely different from the cold control of Blade. He danced. He joked. He embraced absurdity. And he appeared to be enjoying himself. For longtime fans, Seeing this side of Wesley Snipes was almost refreshing. The man who had once built his identity around intensity was showing that he could laugh at himself. But one shadow continued following him. Blade. No matter what role Snipes accepted, questions about Blade were never far away. Fans still associated him with the character. Interviews continued returning to the possibility of another appearance. And the situation became increasingly complicated when Marvel Studios began developing a new Blade project with Mahershala Ali attached to play the vampire hunter. For many actors, being replaced in an iconic role would be painful. For Snipes, it had an additional layer. He had helped prove that Blade could work on film in the first place. Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe existed, before superhero films became billion-dollar machines, Snipes had already carried a black comic book hero through a successful movie franchise. Now, a new generation was preparing to move on without him. Publicly, Snipes generally avoided turning the situation into an ugly rivalry. He acknowledged Mahershala Ali and seemed to understand that characters can outlive the actors who first make them famous. Still, for fans, the question remained: was Wesley Snipes really finished as Blade? Had Hollywood permanently closed that chapter? For years, the answer appeared to be yes. Then, more than 2 decades after Blade, Trinity, something happened that almost nobody expected. A phone call. A secret project. And an opportunity so unlikely that even Wesley Snipes initially seemed unsure it could actually happen. The character everyone thought he had left behind was about to return. And this time, Blade would not simply represent Wesley Snipes' past. He would become the symbol of one of Hollywood's most unexpected comebacks. For years, Wesley Snipes seemed to exist in a strange space between legacy and replacement. He was still Blade in the minds of millions of fans. But Hollywood had moved on. Marvel Studios had announced a new version of Blade, with Mahershala Ali attached to take over the role. For the industry, the message seemed clear. A new era was beginning. The original Blade had become history. That had to be complicated for Snipes. After all, he had not merely played the character. He had helped define him. When the first Blade film arrived in 1998, superhero movies did not dominate popular culture the way they would in later decades. There was no Marvel Cinematic Universe. There were no yearly billion-dollar comic book spectacles. Studios were still uncertain about how seriously audiences would take superheroes outside of a handful of established properties. Then Wesley Snipes walked onto the screen dressed in black leather, carrying a sword, and made Blade feel dangerous, modern, and completely believable. He gave the character attitude. He gave him rhythm. He gave him physical authenticity. And more importantly, he proved that audiences would show up. So when Marvel began preparing a new Blade without Snipes, fans naturally wondered how he felt. Was he angry? Resentful? Disappointed? Publicly, Snipes remained relatively measured. He did not launch a campaign against Mahershala Ali. He did not pretend the role belonged to him forever. Instead, he appeared to accept that Hollywood franchises evolve and that iconic characters eventually pass from one actor to another. Still, there is a difference between accepting something intellectually and feeling nothing emotionally. For Snipes, Blade represented one of the greatest achievements of his career. It was also tied to the period before everything went wrong. Before the legal battle. Before prison. Before years of rebuilding. Blade was a reminder of who Wesley Snipes had once been at the peak of his power. And then years later, the phone rang. Ryan Reynolds reached out. The proposal was unexpected. Snipes was being invited to return as Blade in Deadpool and Wolverine. At first, even Snipes reportedly had doubts about whether such a return could actually happen. Marvel already had plans involving a new Blade. The idea of bringing back the original actor, especially after so much time, felt almost impossible. But that impossibility was exactly what made the opportunity so powerful. The project was kept secret. For audiences, there was no long marketing campaign preparing them for the surprise. No major announcement. No months of speculation officially confirming his involvement. Then the moment arrived. Wesley Snipes stepped back onto the screen as Blade. The reaction was immediate. For longtime fans, it was more than a cameo. It was a collision between past and present. The man who had once helped open the door for modern superhero cinema was standing inside the most successful superhero universe of the modern era. The symbolism was almost too perfect. For decades, people had debated Wesley Snipes' legacy. Some focused on the box office success. Some focused on the conflict surrounding Blade, Trinity. Some focused on the tax case. Some remembered only the prison sentence. But in that moment, audiences remembered something else. Why they had loved him in the first place. The posture. The voice. The controlled arrogance. The feeling that Blade did not need anyone's approval. Snipes had aged, of course. More than 20 years had passed since the third Blade film. But the character was still there. And perhaps the most striking element of the return was how naturally he seemed to occupy the role again. It did not feel like an actor desperately trying to recreate his youth. It felt like an older Blade. A man who had survived. That interpretation carried an emotional weight that could never have existed in 1998. Because now the audience knew Wesley Snipes had survived something too. Not vampires. Not supernatural monsters. But disgrace. Legal consequences. Prison. Career decline. And years of uncertainty about whether he still had a place in Hollywood. His return also carried a note of humor. In Deadpool and Wolverine, Blade makes a joke suggesting there has only ever been one Blade. The line worked because audiences understood the complicated history behind it. Mahershala Ali had been announced as the new Blade. Marvel had spent years trying to develop that new film. And yet here was Wesley Snipes, standing on screen again with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what the character meant to fans. It was playful. But it also felt defiant. And then came another remarkable twist. Snipes' return earned him recognition from Guinness World Records for the extraordinary length of time between his appearances as the Marvel character. That achievement transformed the cameo into something larger. It officially connected two very different eras of superhero cinema. The original Blade franchise belonged to a period before Marvel Studios reshaped Hollywood. Deadpool and Wolverine belonged to the world that came afterward. Wesley Snipes had now existed in both. For an actor whose career once appeared permanently damaged, that was not a small thing. But the comeback also raised a more difficult question. Was this simply nostalgia? A final salute to an aging action star? Or had Wesley Snipes genuinely reclaimed part of the career he once lost? Because while audiences celebrated Blade's return, the real story was not about a vampire hunter. It was about a man being allowed, for one unforgettable moment, to walk back into the mythology that had once made him immortal. And after everything Wesley Snipes had endured, that moment carried a weight no superhero script could have invented. Wesley Snipes' return as Blade created a powerful image. The sunglasses were back. The sword was back. The attitude was back. And for a few minutes, it almost felt as if the years between his original films and his unexpected comeback had disappeared. But they had not. That is the uncomfortable truth behind every great comeback story. You can return to the stage. You can return to the screen. You can hear audiences cheer your name again. But you cannot recover time. And for Wesley Snipes, time may have been the greatest thing he lost. The years surrounding his legal battle and imprisonment arrived during a period when Hollywood was transforming at extraordinary speed. The kind of action star Snipes had once represented was changing. Traditional studio vehicles were becoming less dominant. Massive intellectual properties and interconnected franchises were becoming the center of the business. Most importantly, superhero cinema exploded. That detail matters because Wesley Snipes had already been there. He had already helped demonstrate that a comic book character could succeed on the big screen. He had already worn the costume. He had already built the franchise. Yet when superhero movies became Hollywood's most powerful commercial force, Snipes was no longer standing at the center of that transformation. That is one of the most painful ironies of his career. Imagine reaching the future before everyone else, only to be absent when the rest of the world finally arrives. While other actors signed long-term franchise contracts, Snipes was dealing with legal problems and eventually prison. While Marvel Studios was building interconnected cinematic worlds, his own superhero legacy was frozen. While a new generation of actors became global icons through comic book roles, Snipes was trying to rebuild a reputation damaged by years of negative headlines. There is no way to know exactly what his career would have looked like under different circumstances. Perhaps he would have remained a major leading man. Perhaps another franchise would have emerged. Perhaps his career would have slowed naturally, as most careers eventually do. But what makes his story haunting is the uncertainty. There is an entire version of Wesley Snipes' career that never happened. Movies he never made. Roles he was never offered. Collaborations that never occurred. Years during which his name might have remained near the top of studio casting lists. Those possibilities are impossible to measure. But the absence is still visible. After his release, Snipes continued acting, and his performances reminded audiences that the talent had not disappeared. Yet the scale was different. He was no longer automatically treated like one of Hollywood's dominant action stars. And reputation is difficult to repair. Once the public learns a scandal, the scandal often becomes attached to the name forever. For some people, Wesley Snipes is Blade. For others, he is the actor who went to prison over taxes. Both identities exist at the same time. That tension has shaped his legacy. It also raises a difficult question about celebrity culture. How long should a person's worst chapter define them? Snipes served his sentence. He returned to work. He continued acting. But legal punishment and cultural punishment are not the same thing. A prison term ends on a specific date. Public judgment does not. Search a famous person's name years after a scandal, and the controversy can still appear beside the achievements. The internet rarely forgets. Hollywood rarely forgets either. But sometimes Hollywood does something stranger. It remembers selectively. It celebrates the nostalgia while avoiding the difficult history. That is why Snipes' return as Blade was so fascinating. Audiences were not simply celebrating a character. They were celebrating a version of Wesley Snipes from before everything became complicated. The applause carried memories of 1998. Memories of a younger actor moving through fight scenes with extraordinary speed. Memories of a time when his career appeared limitless. For some viewers, the return offered redemption. For others, it was simply fan service. And perhaps it was both. The important thing is that Snipes was there to experience it. He had lived long enough to see the character that defined him become legendary. He had also lived long enough to watch another generation discover that legacy. There is something deeply human about that. Careers are often described using simple words: success, failure, comeback. Real lives are not that clean. Wesley Snipes succeeded spectacularly. He made serious mistakes. He faced consequences. He lost years. He returned. He worked again. And eventually, the industry that had once seemed to move beyond him invited him back into one of his most famous roles. None of that erases what happened. But neither should what happened erase everything that came before or after. At 64, Wesley Snipes is no longer the young man audiences first saw in New Jack City. He is no longer the seemingly invincible action star of the late 1990s. His face carries more years. His career carries more scars. His story carries more contradictions. And perhaps that is why his return felt stronger than simple nostalgia. The younger Wesley Snipes played Blade like a man who believed he could defeat anything. The older Wesley Snipes returned as someone who had already discovered that some battles cannot be won without losing something along the way. That difference changes the meaning of the character. It changes the meaning of the man. And it makes the final chapter of Wesley Snipes' story much more interesting than the rise or the fall. Because the question is no longer whether he can become the star he once was. The real question is whether he needs to. Perhaps survival itself is the achievement. Perhaps walking back onto that screen after everything was the victory. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Wesley Snipes' story is not simply that he fell. It is knowing how much more might have been possible if those lost years had never disappeared. At 64 years old, Wesley Snipes has already lived several different lives inside the same career. He has been the hungry young actor trying to break into Hollywood. He has been the rising star, the action hero, the franchise leader, the controversial figure, the convicted man, the prisoner, the returning actor, and finally, the legend invited back to reclaim one of the characters that made him unforgettable. That is what makes his story difficult to reduce to a single headline. Was Wesley Snipes a victim of Hollywood? Not entirely. Was he responsible for choices that damaged his own career? Yes. Was he permanently destroyed by those choices? No. And that may be the most important part of the story. For years, the public narrative around Wesley Snipes was dominated by the fall. That is how celebrity culture often works. Success can take decades to build, but scandal can redefine a person overnight. One courtroom photograph can become more memorable than years of professional achievement. One legal case can follow a name longer than dozens of successful films. But time has a way of complicating simple judgments. As the years passed, audiences began remembering something else. They remembered the talent. They remembered the physical precision. They remembered the charisma. They remembered the fact that Wesley Snipes had been doing something revolutionary before Hollywood even understood how valuable it would become. Today, superhero cinema is one of the most commercially dominant forms of entertainment in the world. But back in 1998, Blade was a risk. The character was not one of Marvel's most famous heroes. The film was darker than many comic book adaptations. Its protagonist was a black vampire hunter who moved through a violent world with almost no interest in being traditionally heroic. And at the center of it all was Wesley Snipes. He made the character believable. More importantly, he made the character cool. That contribution matters. It is easy to look backward after an industry has changed and assume the transformation was inevitable. It was not. Every successful genre shift is built by people who take risks before the formula is proven. Snipes was one of those people. His Blade trilogy arrived years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe would redefine blockbuster filmmaking. That does not mean the entire superhero revolution belongs to him. But it does mean his place in that history should not be ignored. And perhaps that is why his return decades later felt so satisfying. It was not only about nostalgia. It felt like recognition. Hollywood has a habit of celebrating people after the moment when celebration would have mattered most. Sometimes an actor is appreciated only after their career has slowed. Sometimes a movie once dismissed is later called influential. Sometimes a performance audiences took for granted becomes iconic years later. Wesley Snipes has experienced that strange cycle. His mistakes remain part of the record. They should. Redemption does not require pretending the past never happened. A second chance is meaningful precisely because the first chapter was imperfect. And Snipes' story is deeply imperfect. He lost control of his career. He became involved in a major legal battle. He was convicted. He went to prison. He spent years trying to regain professional momentum. Those facts cannot be edited out. But neither can the comeback. Neither can Dolomite Is My Name. Neither can Coming to America. And neither can that impossible moment when Blade walked onto the screen again. There is a strange kind of poetry in seeing an older Wesley Snipes return to the character. When he first played Blade, he represented youth, power, aggression, and control. Decades later, he represented something different. Endurance. He had survived a career collapse. He had survived public humiliation. He had survived years away from the spotlight. And he had survived the uncomfortable possibility that the industry might never fully welcome him back. In that sense, the older Blade may have been more meaningful than the younger one. Not because he was stronger, because he had endured. This is where the tragedy in Wesley Snipes' story becomes something more complicated than sadness. The tragedy is not that his life was destroyed. It was not. The tragedy lies in the lost time, the opportunities that may never have come, the years during which his career could have evolved differently, the roles that went to someone else, the momentum that disappeared, the version of his Hollywood future that existed only as possibility. Those things cannot be returned. No comeback can recreate them. But life is not always about getting back what was lost. Sometimes it is about deciding what to do with what remains. And Wesley Snipes still has something many actors spend their entire careers trying to achieve. Legacy. There are performances people remember. Characters people quote. Films that continue finding new audiences. And one black-clad vampire hunter who still carries the face, voice, and attitude Snipes gave him more than a quarter-century ago. That is not a small achievement. Hollywood careers eventually end. Box office numbers become old statistics. Awards gather dust. Headlines disappear beneath newer headlines. But cultural memory works differently. Certain images survive. Wesley Snipes, standing in the shadows as Blade, is one of them. Maybe that is the final irony. There was a time when prison seemed capable of becoming the defining fact of Wesley Snipes' life. But decades later, it may simply become one chapter in a much larger story. A painful chapter. A consequential chapter. But not the final one. At 64, Wesley Snipes is still here. Still acting. Still remembered. Still capable of surprising audiences. And after everything he lost, perhaps that is what makes his journey so powerful. He did not receive his old life back. He received something different. A chance to stand in front of the world again and remind everyone that one terrible period does not automatically erase everything that came before it. The tragedy of Wesley Snipes is real. But so is the comeback. And in the end, the comeback may be the part that lasts.